All right, welcome to this joint webinar between BC Teacher-Librarian Association and Canadian School Libraries on action research in the School Library Learning Commons. We're going to be taking a look at the research toolkit and talking about how you can do action research in your libraries, why it matters, and what it is that research does for us. My name is Joseph Jeffrey. I am the current chair for Canadian School Libraries, as well as BCTLA's professional development coordinator for this year. Well, for another week, and then we'll see if I get challenged in the election on that. But anyway, so Clitlitine habe keo watel delti. Netzelsla habe yon su on watti su itsen inkez su on awalye. I respectfully acknowledge that I am coming to you today from the traditional unceded territory of the Lheidli T'enneh, and I get the enormous pleasure of being able to live, work, and play on these lands. When I do a land acknowledgement, I always like to point out a few of the words in it. My favorite to point out is the word KO in our land acknowledgement. So KO in its most literal translation is territory, but its actual meaning is the land that we walk and take responsibility for. And that, to me, speaks a lot about both Indigenous worldviews and also how centralized land-based and experiential learning is to everything within our local Lheidli culture. And as I always begin these, I like to ask you as participants to think about the land that you get to walk and the responsibility you take for it and how you choose to give back to the land so the land can give to you. I'm going to give you a second to think about that, and then we're going to move on. So the Canadian School Library Research Toolkit supports school library practitioners as they explore their own practice through research. This is a place that we've put together a amalgamation of everything that's out there for research and try to distill it in such a way that it's easy to understand and easy to implement for a practicing teacher librarian. So someone who has a class or is in a non-enrolling state where they've got classes coming in all day, but they want to improve their practice. How can they go about doing it? Well, why would we? What is it about research that might appeal to us? Well, the kind of questions you sort of hear about research are things like, who has the time? It's not, research is something that stuffy people do in like universities. I'm not a researcher, I can't possibly. Well, yeah, you can. And that's kind of where action research comes in, is it's the kind of research you can do to help you grow your practice by reflecting and thinking about what you do and how you can do it better. And by using evidence-based practice, by using research to help inform what you do in your classroom, what you do in your library, what you do with every aspect of your teaching, you can make better decisions because you are informed about what's happening and how it's happening. So there is a distinct need in Canada for research into library learning commons. Unfortunately, we are facing fewer and fewer professional researchers in Canada for school libraries. Right now, U of A's winding down. Most of the people that have been the practitioners Queen's has a great staff of um, itinerant people that they bring in to teach courses, but they're not. There's not really as many long-term staff that are doing the research piece, that are employed by the university to actually go out and uh, do longitudinal studies, uh, do empirical research. The same is true of U of A and many of the other places that deal with teacher librarian issues like UBC. There are a handful, but it's definitely diminishing within the field. And so, as that is happening, we still need evidence-based practice. We still need to find ways to improve our practice through research. And so, why we choose to do this is to assess and push back on the commonly held assumptions about practice that we might have ourselves, because we don't necessarily know where the issues are until we start examining them deeply. And it can inform our future practice, it can inform what we're choosing to do, and help us make better decisions. So, how do you know if you're really doing research? Well, is it conducted properly? Are you using an appropriate methodology? Are you following ethical guidelines? And by that, sounds scary, but all I really mean is, are you thinking about what the problem is? Are you putting together a plan? Are you choosing some good tools to use? Are you making sure you're not doing anything that's against the teacher regulations or against, like, that might be criminal in nature? You're not trapping students in a room or getting them to face off against each other in a wave style scenario for all of the you people who read The Wave. And do you understand the scope and application of what you're doing? And are you sharing your learning? If you keep it to yourself, it's not really research. It's kind of just for you. But if you're sharing it out, that's suddenly where it becomes research, where you are sharing and growing the body of knowledge that other people have. And so, what is the impact when you do this? Why does it matter? Well, more and more over the last little while, there have been voices pushing against some of things that teacher librarians do. There is quite possibly going to be a new government in BC in the near future. We'll find out, I guess, this weekend where we're going and what we're doing. And that, one of the possibilities seems to be making a very strong case for why we should not exist as teacher librarians. The kind of stuff that we do to support students is perhaps not what they are in favor of. And so having research, having that stuff that you can pull out and go, here is why we exist. Here is the concrete stuff that we can use to make our case when things are happening. It doesn't always affect everything, but it can make the argument easier in a lot of ways, especially if you have an administrator who's kind of on the fence, who's like, I don't know what you really do. Or you've got a new person who's like, is this library thing worth it? And it makes the case of not just why you exist in the school, but why all of us exist in the schools. And what I mean by that is it tells what the story of what you do and why it matters and how those two things connect. And so I'll give you an example here. When I first moved to high school, I moved into a high school that had not had a teacher librarian in a few years. And my stats, as I was looking at them, we were circulating about 100 books a month for 1,500-ish students. And it really, no one was coming in. And I started having to ask the questions like, well, why isn't things moving and what can we be doing? And while I didn't necessarily know all of the steps I was doing and that it was all action research, what all the things I was doing to ask the correct questions and find out what I was doing and how to improve it by doing things like going to Pro-D sessions with Joni, where she helped me build a much better virtual learning commons, or start a student library advisory council to actually steer me in the right direction. Those steps that we took to build that out were all informed by research. And when I took this to my principal and shared when I got a new principal, where we came from and where we had got to, he suddenly understood, like, oh, this is what happens. Because he used to be the vice principal of the school back when it had no TL. And then he was suddenly here as our principal. And he's like, what's going on here? Like, why are there suddenly students in the library? What what is this? And that evidence was able to make the case for not just why we existed, but like how we could get more money into the library. He was willing to invest in the library because he saw the outcomes and could link them and put them into his school plan for student success, which when they hate writing them, principals really do not like writing those things. So the more you can give them to like throw in there so that they have to write less, they do seem to appreciate that, at least in my experience. So this is Ross Todd, who sadly passed away in 2022. But one of his big things was about evidence-based methodology in school libraries. And he was a school library researcher at Rutgers, and during my master's, he was one of the people that I reached out to and was connected a lot with as part of my learning journey as a teacher librarian. And he said that for school libraries, the big question regarding evidence-based practices: why do school libraries matter today, particularly in the context of an educational world that increasingly relies on complex, diverse, and often conflicting sources of information? And that answer lies in the student outcomes, specifically what school librarians can do in their instructional practices to ensure those outcomes. Evidence-based practice recognizes multiple sources, types of evidence, and ways of gathering evidence. The use of multiple sources facilitates triangulation, an approach to data analysis that synthesizes data from multiple sources. By using and comparing data from a number of sources, you can develop stronger claims about your practice's impact and outcomes. And what that really means is gather your evidence, look at the problem from different angles, and think about what the story the evidence is telling you. How is it pointing together? And not to confuse correlation with causation, but to look at all the data and make your decisions. And I noticed my co-presenter Diana has got here, so I'm going to pause at this point and let Diana introduce herself.
Thanks so much, Joseph, and I apologize for coming late. I'm chiming in from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and just coming off of actually a really wonderful teacher librarian network meeting that happened after school. We started at 4 and it was after 6 o'clock, and people were still there because school library professionals are passionate about what they do. And that's why action research is so exciting, because it's a chance to talk about your practice in a way that just makes sense. And there's so many ways to do that. I am a practicing teacher librarian in the Toronto District School Board in an elementary school library. And I'm also pleased to say that I think I've written about 7 Treasure Mountain Canada papers, from the very first one that was held in Edmonton to two for the last one over in BC, even though I did not have the pleasure of attending in person. So I'm hoping that with Joseph, I'll be able to answer some of your questions, alleviate some of your anxieties, and hopefully show you that action research in school librarianship, especially as it relates to Treasure Mountain Canada 8, is not only possible, but doable and exciting. So thank you, Joseph. I'm going to turn it back to you to talk about sort of the approaches. Don't get too scared, because we're going to get to some of the more approachable approaches in a bit.
So I talked a bit earlier about like those longitudinal studies and empirical data, and the idea that we have these are the kind of research approaches that professional researchers can do because they have that time to do it. They get grants and they can actually look at some of that long range pieces. That doesn't mean that you as a teacher librarian can't engage in some of these stuff. Like if you're making notes every year and have enough data, you could potentially do a correlational study over the course of your career. But generally speaking, this is not the kind of stuff that we do. But it's important to know it exists out there because without it, what we're doing with action research is only a small part of it. And action research is a great place to look for researchers for, well, I noticed this in several action researches. Maybe this is something that we can look at more and can be a larger jumping off point. And so it is something that's really important that this is sort of the next step. And it is also something that I would encourage some of you to look at if you do want to pursue this. I'm currently trying to figure out how to navigate my PhD at the moment, and like I'm applying for different programs and stuff like that. So this is very much on my mind as well, because noticing that we are lacking researchers, I do feel it's something that I want to contribute to. But so your correlation studies, this is sort of your big studies where you're looking at how different pieces of the puzzle fit together. You're generally looking at where correlation and causation are actually connected and how to spot where you're getting sort of false flags on that they're coming apart and not actually as together as it looks for, and looking at how the efficiencies and the efficacy of that research is. The empirical stuff is sort of your observed and measured, sort of more of what you might have been used to from your days doing science at high school or university. That knowledge from experience, the thorough testing of a hypothesis, trial, error, try again, make it work again and again, make sure that you haven't made a mistake. As one day in my chemistry class in grade 12, we all had to redo an experiment 4 times because we could not figure out what we had done wrong. And if our data was right, we were all about to become millionaires because we had just solved how to get more energy out of petrol than you put in for burning it. Turns out we were wrong. We had all made a mistake on the calculation because we had the teacher had written the formula up and missed one part of it. And so all of us hadn't gone back to our notes. We'd all copied the formula from the board. It's a good lesson in testing and making sure that you're not doing something wrong and knowing whether or not your answer is reasonable or not. So then we have action research. This is about starting with a question, just like all other research. But that question is normally more personal. It's more about you and your practice rather than the teacher down the road or the whole school. It might be to do with those things, but generally it starts with you and what you notice about you. And it's about looking inwards, examining your practice, and choosing a single thing you want to try and alter. What would happen if I did this? Has that made an effect? What if I had changed this thing or tried this thing? It's about those small incremental parts and developing practical solutions that will tell you whether or not you're moving in the right direction. So you start with your baseline, you're trying something, seeing if it works, and then if it's not, you revert back to where you were and move on. And if it did work, fantastic, that can become part of your routine now. And really looking at what is and isn't working. And it's all about you as a professional, not the outside expert coming in and sort of peering over your shoulder and peering over your practice. So, research stages. As I said, like you kind of always start with the question, what's the problem? What is the thing you're starting with? As teacher librarians, we're all fairly familiar with inquiry-based models and like that kind of practice, but sometimes we forget we can be our own subjects for that inquiry. We can think about ourselves, and instead of just teaching the kids how to do inquiry, what if we did the inquiry ourselves? What if we were the subject of our own inquiry? And stepping back and thinking about that. What do we want to change? How do we want to try something different? And it can be on your own. It can be with someone. And then looking at what's out there for literature. And that can be proper papers. That can be like reading scientific journals and educational journals. But it can also just be going on social media and seeing what other people are saying. And what if I tried that thing that's working? And for this teacher, would it work for me? But knowing that you then need to think about how are you going to implement it so you'll know whether or not it worked. Are you just going to jump in, or are you going to think properly and go, okay, I'm going to start from a certain point. I'm going to take some data before I make that change, and then I can look and see, did this actually make an effect? Because just going online and going, oh, that looks good, and then doing it, well, that's fine, but it doesn't really tell you at the end of it if it worked other than a gut feeling. And with research, we want a little more than a gut feeling. We want to actually know if it worked so that we can make sure our practice changes. And so that's sort of that establishing the methodology, figuring out how you're going to start it, how you're going to stop it, how long you're going to go, and what you can do. And then present it, organize it, organize your findings, figure out how you're going to put it out there into the world. So over the last year, the BC Teacher-Librarian Association has been engaged in a research project around school library design. So we started with the question, what is wrong with the current designs of school libraries? Where are the errors and what things are going right? Because we're getting more and more schools built in BC, and some are amazing and some are filled with errors. And how do we make sure that we're communicating to when one school district makes an error or one build is like, that really doesn't work. How are we making sure that other people know, don't try that, try this instead. This thing works, that thing doesn't. And so we turned to literature, we did a full lit review, we put together how we were going to ask the questions. We sent it out to the 35 new schools built over the last 5 years. And we got those answers and we compiled them. And then we've published it. And it will be formally presented at the AGM after the BCTLA conference next week, but it should be going up online the following week for everyone. And this was a big research project where we were trying to figure this out. And that was a larger scale, but it still started with these same stages: identifying the problem, exploring it, establishing how we were going to go at this, collecting and evaluating the data, and then organizing and presenting our findings. Diana, did you have anything to say on that one? I saw you pop on for a sec. No? Jump on to the next thing. So what are the action research stages? So if those are the general stages, here are the action research stages. Basically, very similar to how we would present this to students. Ponder the problem. Peruse the research. Pursue the plan. Probe, analyze, interpret the data, and then pause, reflect, share your findings. Very similar to our research stages that we would do with kids. How do we do this? In the exact same way. We really want to emphasize that action research is to teacher learning as inquiry-based learning is to student learning. And that if kids see us doing this and see us reflecting that inquiry model, reflecting that inquiry-based learning and that lifelong love of learning, and we talk about it with them and say, while you're doing this inquiry, I'm doing this inquiry. I'm learning at the same time as you're learning. I'm learning in this way, you're learning in that way. We're all learners together. Diana, did you have anything to add to that?
No, and just like how every student inquiry project looks different and needs different kind of supports, the same thing for our action research. Some inquiries may be more heavy in the perusing the research. Some might be more heavy in terms of the probing and analyzing the data. It's okay because as we know, as teacher librarians and other school library professionals, inquiry projects look different from person to person. So that's okay. It's all good.
So there's sort of two main research methods: qualitative versus quantitative. Your quantitative data, your numerical data, your statistical data, the kind that can be gathered from your integrated library system. A lot of this is, to use Heinlein's term, grokkable, which means like to intuitively understand. It's something that's like, yeah, I get that. You look at it, it's just like, yep, that makes sense. And it's often the raw picture. Now, I say that is understandable as a math science person. For some of you, looking at a table of statistics might be like looking at the inside of a car engine and going, well, this moves, but I don't know how, because I wouldn't be able to tell you how it moves. Your qualitative is, it's the behaviors, the verbal, it's the interactive parts, it's how you communicate through story, through anecdote, through vignettes. It is often harder for people to intuitively understand, especially in Western epistemology of research. And it tends to be the bigger picture. The other thing, these two qualitative data and qualitative models are more akin to how traditional Indigenous research is done. Research through story, research through the sharing of knowledge orally over time, building the body of knowledge through discussion, as opposed to concrete data that is written down. And so what you'll find if you are delving into some of the background research when you're doing your lit reviews, if you're looking specifically at Indigenous topics, there'll be much less traditional quantitative data on a lot of the stuff, as opposed to qualitative data, which is coming from the discussions and that oral storytelling. And in order to understand that better, I really recommend you read Joanne Archibald's Indigenous Story Works, which really lays out how that works. I don't have enough time to get into it in detail, but it's a fantastic read to understand Indigenous epistemology of research and how it's not that Indigenous people don't research or didn't have science and research, and that, as has often been said, of like Westerners talking about meeting primitive people when they came over to the New World that was only new to them because other people were living here already. But that research just looked very different and isn't baked into that, or isn't that sort of quantitative piece that is so much a part of how Western culture has seen research. And so when I talk about it being grokkable and like that intuitive understanding, it's intuitive to understand to myself who's been raised in those Western research traditions. But someone who coming from a different traditional background for research might find that qualitative is actually much easier to understand because it's more akin to the cultural background. So, as I said, quantitative data is easier to get sometimes, but can't always give you the full picture. You can pull stats from your ILS, you can pull weeding stats that tell you how many books haven't gone out since whenever. Okay, but what does that tell you? What does it mean if I've got 15% of my collection hasn't circulated? Has there been a teacher librarian for, or was there one not there for a number of years? Would that be why? What is the reason behind it? So quantitative data can help you with the picture, but it doesn't do anything on its own. You kind of need to add context to it. Qualitative data is much harder to get. That oral history, the interviews, everything that's to do with that. But it can help you see the whys of what's happening. And it can also give voice to the subjects of your research, to those who are participating in it. And so a lot of the time when we're doing action research, we want to actually combine the two of them. We want some concrete data, but we also want that data to tell a story such that we can communicate it more easily to those who make decisions. Most school boards like hearing the story. They like hearing the journey. They're less, like, they like seeing the stats as well, don't get me wrong. They do love some numbers, but most of them are more affected by the story behind those numbers than just the raw numbers themselves. So I've talked a little bit about Indigenous epistemology already, but to touch on it a bit more, you've probably heard the phrase, nothing about us without us. And this doesn't just apply to Indigenous epistemology, but any marginalized group. If you're looking at students with disabilities, if you're looking at students who sit somewhere on the LGBTQ spectrum, any kind of thing that you're looking at, you should be working with those people, not doing research to them. And you shouldn't be researching in such a way that people don't know they're being researched. That's part of those ethical guidelines we talked about a little earlier, that you can't just do research on someone without them knowing, consenting. They have to know they're part of research, unless it's like the data is sort of vast and unknowable. You need some level of like chatting with people to be doing something. So if you are, for instance, researching about how you can transform your library learning commons, into a more Indigenous friendly space? Well, you should be chatting with Indigenous students. You should be talking with, in BC, your Indigenous education worker. You should be reaching out and connecting with your Indigenous education department. You should be asking questions and making sure that people are part of those discussions, not just you try something and then see if it works. Because if they don't have a voice in it, then it's being done to them rather than being part of it. Rooting everything in the Indigenous ways of knowing, which in BC is a nice big poster that we have, but also like within each area, you might find that there are additional, more specific local things rather than the pan-Indigenous knowledge that the Indigenous ways of knowing is. So within my territory, within the Clayton KO, we have the Deketh Holistic Learning Model. And place-based learning is a huge part of that, just as it is within the Indigenous ways of knowing. But so is protocol. And that's not a piece in the Indigenous ways of knowing poster. And so when we're doing things, we also need to talk a lot about protocol and the whys and hows of which we do things, and just sort of thinking about those ways we do things and why we do them. And so whatever you're doing, make sure you're rooting it in that local context. So for place-based learning, that's tends to be focused on place, both the physical place and the time. So like here and now, or what, where, and the context of when it is. Not just now as in this time right now, but like the season or how it relates to those different parts. So in Clayton KO, we have 5 seasons within the Deketh knowledge system, which is different to how we're traditionally taught there being 4 seasons. And so knowing those pieces and how they fit together can help us. And where one is coming from can help you inform the view on what is being taken on in the data, and making sure your journey is well documented. Again, within Indigenous epistemology, the researcher is meant to be humble. The researcher is meant to show a level of humility, and that they are a part of the learning, that they're not apart from the learning. And so that's important to note. Diana, any wisdom to add from Ontario, because I'm assuming you're
Yes, because we're hosted on the lands where I am. We are hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. And all of the things that Joseph is saying here are important because, of course, Joseph's context over on the West Coast does not necessarily match those of mine. However, and I mentioned this because sometimes we do some joint inquiries. I'm thinking, for instance, about the one that Joni and I are probably going to be doing for Treasure Mountain Canada 8. And being able to be aware of the different contexts that each individual brings in to their part of the research is important. And it's okay to have multiple perspectives. And so that's why look at the one that Joni and I are going to write if it actually comes together, because it will actually combine British Columbia and Ontario and examine both of those places regarding the particular question. I hope I'm not promoting it a little bit too much there, Joni. I don't want people to start getting a little bit too excited about this.
So an example of this would be I had a teacher a few years ago who really wanted to set up a teepee in our library to see what difference it would make to Indigenous culture. And this, the reason that that wasn't going to work, we had to work with her about the fact that so here in Clayton KO, teepees are not a thing. Like we're the traditional housing was pit houses. Um, teepees are a plains thing. It's not. Well, what about a totem pole? Again, not a thing here. Like we don't have totem poles here in Prince George in the Clayton KO. Like that's a coastal thing, and so trying to a lot of times like the ideas are coming from a place of trying to do something, but aren't necessarily rooted in the correct knowledge because you're not, a lot of the time, if you're not coming at that with that view of nothing about us without us, you wouldn't know these things because you're not asking the right people. You're trying to do things to something rather than do something with someone. So let's talk ethics. So um, when we're talking about ethics and fairness in this, we shouldn't be utilizing research to do things that might be destructive or harmful. We shouldn't be dividing people up and excluding them from different activities and seeing like in those kind of cases like when the idea of trying to do a control group and stuff like that often gets misconstrued into, well, what if we did this? What if I put all of the Indigenous kids over here and did one thing with them and did one thing with the other kids? That's not a good way of doing research. That's right into ethical problems there. Like when you're dividing things up like that. The you should also not be adding things on to overburden as the opposite effect, like pushing too much on. Should neither be taking things away entirely or putting too much on to other people. And things like race, gender, sexuality, that kind of thing, they are only ever factors in research if they're actually relevant to what you're researching. So researching Indigenous grad rates would be an example where whether or not a student is Indigenous matters. Researching whether or not this literacy program works you shouldn't need to collect data on who's Indigenous in your class and who isn't, because that's irrelevant to what you're trying to do. It's whether or not it works. And so knowing what you're trying to do and why, and making sure that anyone who is a part of it in ways that aren't just like, I'm going to try this with the whole class. So if you're just trying to change your teaching methods and like, I'm going to try this with the whole class, you don't need to get consent from all the kids. But if you are going to say, I'm going to try this with my group of learners that struggling with reading, I'm going to try something very specific that might not go well and like might backfire, you do want some consent in there. You want to make sure that they are consenting first. They know what's going to happen. They're choosing to be part of it and can withdraw if they need to. So if you're going to try something that's like I'm going to work with you on this, but there's a chance that your reading skills might deteriorate from this. I don't know what you might do that might do that, but like that's the kind of thing that you want some consent on. Anything to add on that for ethics, Diana?
Nothing to add. You did a great job of covering it.
So privacy. Um, when we're talking about data, you always should be anonymizing your data. There's no reason to specify the individual. So going back to that BCTLA research project I was talking about with school library design, we asked all of the schools that for some pretty honest and raw feedback on the designs that they had. When we put together the data, it was all anonymized. There was no way to tell what school any of these results was from. We didn't give raw results. Everything was amalgamated. So you got 50% said this, 20% said that, 10% said that. So even if you know that the 30, who those 35 schools were and who those teacher librarians were, you've got no way to know which answered what. The comments that we got were randomized in order, so that even if you knew what order the results went in, we mixed them up so when there were comments, they weren't necessarily like this comment, the first comment in each of the comment things go together. We made sure that we were accountable to all of that data, that we made sure it could not be like used in a way that might get back to someone, because we were asking for stuff that was potentially like a problem. If someone knew like this person saying this about like their space, and like we wanted to be conscious about those things, because it was important that we got the information and could present it in a way that was going to build up capacity rather than try and tear down people who had like the mistakes were made. Because at no point during what we were researching did it ever feel like the architects who had made the errors were intentionally going out of their way to build bad library designs. In fact, a lot of the things they were doing would have been perfect for a public library. The problem was they were taking designs that were great for public libraries or university libraries and applying them to a context where you needed dedicated instructional space and other things like that, that was crossing a whole bunch of different problems because there wasn't that understanding of where school libraries fit into it. And so that was sort of important to us, but we couldn't have done that, couldn't have got that data if we hadn't committed to that privacy piece. Now, minimizing risk. Depending on what you're doing, you, as I said, like you can have risks, and that risk is okay, like as long as you are thinking about how you're minimizing it. And that privacy piece can be an important part, but it can also be as much as like if you are interviewing students who are LGBTQ, making sure you're not advertising that's what you're doing outside of them, like they need to consent to it, but not putting a big poster on your door that says LGBTQ interviews happening now, because like if the student doesn't want to be outed, like that's a problem. Like making sure that you're doing it in a place that's they can feel safe. And like the same can be true of students with disabilities. Not every disability is visible. Not everyone looks, and you can just look at them and go, yeah, that person's got a disability. And so knowing that, and if you're doing research, choosing not to out students who might have a learning disability or might have be neurodivergent or whatever it is that's going on. And academic honesty, making sure you're not making up data, making sure you're not embellishing your data, making sure you're not dropping data that you choose to doesn't conform with your views. So this is hopefully most of you have heard of Andrew Wakefield at this point. If you haven't, he was the guy that did the autism vaccine research in the 1990s in England. He used to be Dr. Andrew Wakefield, but he lost his license to practice medicine. He lost his license as a researcher because he cherry-picked his data, worked on a very small data set, and knew what outcome he wanted and presented his data in the first place to make that happen. That is a problem. You don't want to do that. You should not be coming into your research trying to prove an outcome. You will have a hypothesis how you think it's going to go. But if you are shaping all of your data to make it happen, that's a problem. You need to be aware of that kind of thing. And that's what academic honesty is. And making sure that you're not putting your data into ChatGPT and making ChatGPT run it. One, privacy, and two, it hallucinates and can cause problems and might cause some issues if it decides to drop data and you don't realize. So, data analysis basics. What is data? How do we analyze it? So, information that is collected in a systemic manner, purposefully examined to make decisions. That is what the definition of data is. And that does not just mean quantitative. It just means that you are collecting it in a systematic manner. If it's through interviews, if it's through questionnaires, if it's through anecdotes, whatever you're choosing to do, but you're doing it the same way each time. You're asking the same questions. Everyone's got the same chance to answer it. That's systematic. And that you're using it to help inform decisions. And you're examining it. Not just, as I had a discussion with someone today when they were talking about their weeding data, oh, so I can just discard everything on this list. No, that's not what weeding data is for. You need to purposefully examine it to make decisions. The purposefully examining part is important. You don't just throw out everything because it was on the list. There might be reasons you don't think about until you do it properly. So analyzing quantitative data is about taking the raw data and turning it into usable information. So first, you've got to get the data, and then you've got to organize it. So if you don't organize your data, then you don't really know how you can compare it. You can do that in tables, you can do that in charts. There's lots of ways you can do that. For analyzing qualitative data, you still have to get the data, but rather than organize it, you're doing something called coding it, which is applying a schema to it to look for patterns and trends. So you're trying to figure out how you're going to extract the commonalities in the data. If it's looking for specific words or word groups, if it's looking for pieces that are correlating between each of these. How you choose to do it is up to you. Some people use notations with symbols. Some use color coding or highlighting to find instances where those are matching. But you kind of have a code, a schema to put to it to figure out that qualitative data. And then the validity. How much does your data actually, the questions you're doing, measure what you're meaning to measure? Or did you miss the mark? So, going back again to that BCTLA project, we had to put out the survey twice. The first time, we didn't get the data we wanted because we asked the wrong questions. We didn't realize we'd asked the wrong questions, but when the way in which we'd worded things was just subtly wrong enough that the answers we got, were too ambiguous to know whether it meant what we thought it meant. So we had to redo it. And we threw out that first set of data and said, look, we're gonna have to do this again because our validity was wrong. We could not be sure that thing A meant thing A. Like, it was too, we didn't have the wording right. Reliability. Is your method of collecting data stable and consistent? Are you sending out it like once we realized we had a problem, we couldn't then change the form without throwing out all the old data and starting again, because otherwise it's not stable and consistent and we get into problems. And how are you controlling for inaccuracies? That's the external data when people are giving you information. How are you making sure that you're looking for things that might be incorrect? For instance, signing up for this. I had a few people that put in the wrong email address or put in email addresses that had missed a letter off or hit the next letter on the keyboard and I get bounce backs. Those are inaccuracies I had to account for even just running a webinar. How are you controlling your bias, that internal thing, the stuff that might skew you to one side or the other so that you're not looking at the information, the data objectively? And then visualize the data. And what I mean by visualize isn't necessarily in a table or a chart, depends on what you're doing, because this is both the quantitative and qualitative. It's a visualization is about how you communicate the story of your information to someone else. It could be in an infographic. That's how, in our school district, we encourage our teacher librarians to tell their library story at the end of the year through infographics, through little bits that can tell that data across time. You don't want to oversimplify it too much because you really don't want to fall into that trap of correlation equals causation when it doesn't. You have to look for, is this actually causing this or not? And then sharing. How are you going to share it out? Well, who's your audience? How do they need to know it? And how you tell your story is up to you. You can do graphs and infographics. That's fine. You could also do an interpretive dance, a skit, a song, a poem, a rap. I've presented multiple things via rap. Narratives, journeys, videos, speeches, pictographs. How you choose to tell your story is sort of unique to you. I presented my final thesis project as a rap. Like that was the central part I did. In one of my graduate diplomas, I presented it as an escape room where people had to unlock different boxes and figure things out as part of it because that was going to cause them to make connections and utilize the knowledge that was there and actually try and figure out some of the same things that I had figured out and unlocked as I was doing this and try to replicate through puzzles for them. And it's really up to you how you tell your story because it's your story. So with all that said, with all that on action research said, Treasure Mountain Canada, the big reason that Canadian School Libraries and BCTLA is doing this. Last time we had Treasure Mountain Canada, it was actually in BC. It was part of the New Westminster Conference in 2022. This time it will be in Ontario next year in 2025 in January and / February. It's January 31st and February 1st as part of the Ontario Library Association Super Conference. The registration for that will be opening mid-November. And there's early bird pricing on that as well. And I'll send that out afterwards. We really hope that we'll see some of you there. But what is it that Treasure Mountain Canada 8 is trying to accomplish? Well, in general, Treasure Mountain Canada is about addressing learning for the future. It's about looking forward to where learning is going. And is about supporting the reinvention of school libraries to address the evolving information and technology needs of learning for the future. You can probably guess that AI is going to creep in here. We're going to be talking about that. We invite researchers, school library practitioners, educational leaders, policymakers to collaborate and move forward together, to come together and do things. Last time, our keynote for the dinner was the superintendent of West Vancouver, Chris Kennedy, talking about the importance of libraries and why libraries make a difference. And from talking from a policymaker's point of view, someone who is in control of his school district and can push that forward, and why inquiry-based learning is so central to his school district. Collaborating and collaboratively exploring ideas, inspiring each other, and building collective knowledge of the learning commons approach as sustainable school improvement. That is connecting back to leading learning and other documents to think about how we work as a team within a school, that the school librarian is not an isolated thing. A teacher librarian is not an island, that it's a web connecting out to all facets of the school, that it's centralized. To analyze the Canadian research available and encourage further academic and site-based research, that action research that we are talking about right now, and to alert the school community and educational community of the urgent need to refocus learning for the future and ignite the potential of school library learning commons. Those are all the goals of Treasure Mountain Canada. And for Treasure Mountain Canada 8, we are focusing that on the newly published Foundations for School Library Learning Commons in Canada. That is the central document that we want everything to connect back to. If you haven't read it yet, you can find it on canadianschoollibraries.ca. And the Foundations is sort of the underpinning of leading learning. If you look at leading learning as what you as teacher librarians need, Foundations is the thing that you need your administrators to read. You need your school board to read. You need your superintendent to read, because it's what is going to give the basics that allow you to do your job better and to build a better library learning commons within your district.
The interesting thing too is that Foundations itself is a result of a previous Treasure Mountain Canada. That when all these like-minded individuals get together to do action research, to share each other's action research results, and then talk about, well, where are the gaps? Where do we need to go forward from here? Because Foundations was a result of, well, where are the gaps and what do we need to address those gaps? Joseph, I'm sure you could talk a little bit more about that in detail.
And that was at the last Treasure Mountain Canada in New Westminster. We began with leading learning and looking at the gaps in leading learning, which led to our 2023 updates to leading learning that added brand new sections in and ended up with us adding questions to provoke thinking to each one of the standards. But then we were left with this sort of pile of stuff on the floor. We'd managed to shove everything that we could into all the different categories we could, but we still had this whole big thing left over. And it was basically all the stuff that used to be in that old red book, Achieving Information Literacy by Diane Olberg, Marlene Aislinn, and Jennifer Branch. And that was stuff that hadn't got a place in leading learning, because it was a lot about the stuff that needed to be there to do the leading learning. And we kind of thought for a long time, well, we're past that. But we're not. We kind of need to keep that in mind, because it's the stuff that provides that foundation. It is what everything else is built on. So we went back and filled in that gap using all of that knowledge. And we hope that you will take a look at it and that you will find the connections in there to either one of the three foundations, equity of access, robust funding, or strong policy, or to one of the frameworks, physical and virtual space, technological infrastructure, human resources, ethics, ethical considerations of libraries, library learning commons management, accountability, assessment of and growth. I think those are the eight.
That
Don't
was
think I
pretty
missed anything.
impressive, Joseph. I was like, well, see, even though it exists online, some of us, who do our learning better with paper have actually printed it out. And I was like, wow, he hit them all. He hit them all.
Yeah, writing it over that 4 months and creating the graphics over and over again. If you read the uh, history of the graphical design in there, which we published into the journal a few months back, that was a lot of work. A lot of thinking about that for many sleepless nights. But uh, there will be a dinner and evening keynote on Friday, January 31st. Our keynote speaker is, oh, her name is escaping me. She is the Librarian Archivist of Canada. Um, so basically, the chief librarian for the whole of Canada, in charge of Archives Canada. She spoke at OLA last year as a keynote speaker and was phenomenal. And I cannot remember her name. I can see her in my mind though. But she will
And
be
I'm
our
blanking on
keynote
her name
speaker.
as well.
She will be our keynote speaker, and then the next day we will have the symposium. We will be at the Intercontinental Hotel and Convention Center in Toronto, which is where OLA Super Conference is as well. Registration will open soon. You have until January 1st to submit a paper. If you want to see the full call for papers, you can click here. I'm going to send this slide deck afterwards along with a link to the recording. And then, Diana, you have some advice.
Because you've heard all about the details of data collection and ethics and things like that. And it may still be very overwhelming for you. So I've just kind of got three basic tips that has propelled me to write 7 of these papers. And actually, technically, I shouldn't call them papers and I shouldn't say writing, because one of the ones that I did for Treasure Mountain Canada 7 was in conjunction with 2 secondary school teacher librarians. Thank you, Joni. By the way, that's archivist Leslie Weir. I believe that's the name.
Yeah, that is the name,
Yes.
Leslie Weir.
But one of these things was it was a recorded conversation. It was almost like just a video podcast. So my 3 tips for you, if you're considering creating something for Treasure Mountain Canada, the first one is do it because it interests you and consider the benefit of others. A lot of people, when they get the shoulder tap from Joseph or somebody else from Canadian School Libraries or from their provincial library association related to schools, will think that that's not anything. No, it's just something I do. But your ordinary truly is someone else's extraordinary. One of the things I do regularly as part of my professional practice is that I take students with me when we go book shopping. And I wrote about that. And I didn't think it was a great big deal at the time. It's like I take students. But I added a little bit of action research to it to investigate, like, does it make a difference? Do people like this? Well, not only did that paper make it to Treasure Mountain Canada, it did inspire other people to take their own. Thank you, Joseph. To take their own path with it. Janelle St. Aubin, who's actually one of the last Angela Thacker Memorial Award winners, she did it. And I love how people will then put their own spin on it, right? That they don't do it the same way you do it, but because that was inspiring to somebody, they take it in a new direction. And then we just keep learning from each other. Joseph, how did you do it with your area?
So we had just won the Indigo grant for so we got several $1,000s from Indigo, and I got some a parent volunteer to come with me, and I would take 3 or 4 students at a time, and we'd go to Indigo and spend $250 on books, and then come back, and like they would get to talk about their picks in front of the whole school at a assembly, and like then we'd do another draw and take another 3 or 4 students from different grades and try and get a spread of kids who and like build up a library, because the reason we won the Indigo grant is our school had burnt down and we had no library. And so we were starting from literally zero. And it was a huge thing. And I remember my director of instruction at the time telling me to get on Twitter and start getting into the community on Twitter. And I found this person on Twitter called Ms. Molly TL, who I was following, and they were talking about taking students, and I thought that was a good idea. And then about
But see,
eight
once
years,
again,
five,
yeah,
6 years later, I managed to meet Diana at a OLA conference. And like, this is kind of how it happens. It's like you're doing research and then it inspires someone else to try something. And then they go on to try something themselves and write about it and inspire someone different who will then go on to write about it.
because I
And
never
like,
would have thought about having the kids afterwards come and present to the rest of the school. Right?
well,
Like that's
yeah,
a neat new dimension.
I didn't even think about it as an option. I was just like, yeah, of course they're gonna talk about it to the school. Um, but like that's the kind of stuff that was going on in our school that just was natural.
Mhm.
And so because it was natural, I didn't even think to write about it. I didn't think to like put a paper together, the Canadian School Library Journal. Like, just wasn't something that made sense to me at the time. It was just I was living by the skin of my teeth at the time, trying to build a library from nothing, and like just taking inspiration from wherever I could get it.
The second point that I have, the second piece of advice, is to have a buddy to bounce ideas off of and to consult. Because sometimes you think, I don't know what I'm doing. I have no clue where this is going. But to be able to talk about it with somebody, especially as you're kind of working through, is great. Even if they're not directly involved in the action research, just to have a sounding board. What do they call it again when is it the rubber ducking? When a computer programmer is trying to figure out what's problematic with
Yeah,
their code. Yeah.
yeah.
But
I have a
it's
rubber
nicer to
duck
have a
for that.
so it's nicer to have an actual real life rubber duck, because then they can answer back and say, yes, you're fine. So the third piece of advice I have for you two is that, and I do not want to sound like I am contradicting anything that Joseph said in this webinar. I'm making it very clear that everything that he said was very important. However, the research methods and final product are important, but it's not to prevent you from contributing. Don't get so caught up on it that it's like, oh my gosh, but am I doing qualitative or quantitative? Am I doing enough? No. So my advice is sort of don't sweat the small stuff. Just jump in, because don't worry. The wonderful thing is we do have people reading these papers. Well, that's why having a buddy is useful too, because they can tell you if, oh, maybe don't forget about this consideration. But we've also got some safety nets at the end, because we've got the wonderful and talented Carol Kirschlin, who, with her committee, previews these papers and reads them and will ask questions about, well, have you thought about this, or what about this, or so we've got safety nets here. So just try it out. So those are my 3 pieces of advice related to writing Treasure Mountain Canada papers. And I'm definitely willing to stick around after the official conclusion of this webinar to answer any more specific questions that people have.
So, and that's a good part to say. This is the official conclusion of this webinar. Thank you very much for being here and listening.